Organizing the Mind, I Will Marry When I Want, and Wizard of the Crow. Professor Ngugi has repeatedly been tipped for the prestigious Nobel Prize for Literature. But despite missing the top literary prize over the years, Professor Ngugi prides himself in consistently winning what he calls the Nobel of the Hearts. Well, I sat down with Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o for an exclusive interview on his life, his works, and his views on contemporary society. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, thank you very much for giving us your time. I want to start from the very beginning because you have written over 40 books. You've been writing since the 1960s. You know, I want to go back to the very beginning, to your early childhood in 1938, which is depicted in your memoirs, Dreams in a Time of War. Take us through your early days and how that's influenced much of your writing.
1938, a very important year in world history, and therefore also in Kenyan history. I was born into Kenya, which was a British settler colony, right? One childhood, which I remember in Limuru, Kenya, was seeing military vehicles, right, on the roads by Limuru, you know. In fact, one of the episodes I tell about in my memoir, Dreams in a Time of War, is of seeing, you know, an accident of a military vehicle, you know, that fell off the road near Limuru and so on. I remember the soldiers and so on, you know, and the pain and all that. I remember that to this day. I also recall the Italian prisoners of war, okay, and they were walking on the roads, and it was the first time for us to see white people, European people. A white settler was always hidden behind big houses, and when he came out, it was to give orders and so on. And one year, they all disappeared, all at once. And I could, as a child, I could never figure out what happened to those Italians who used to come to our village, you know. And as I described in my memoir, you know, I can discover, of course, it was the end of the Second World War, and now the Italian workers had returned to their own home.
You grew up, so let's go back to how you grew up in this very big household with four mothers and a large community. And you talk about a bit of that in your memoir, Dreams in a Time of War, where you write, we often you know, when you talk about seeing the prisoners of war as your first image, though, is it unimaginable to you where you are today, that you ended up becoming a renowned novelist, a playwright, you know, a critic?
I think I would say I would credit my interest in literature, in story, back to my father's house, or with my father and the four mothers we had. Because as you say, we would crowd, particularly in the senior mother's house. That's why I remember we all went there every evening. And there'd be storytelling, you know, as we waited for the food to cook and so on, or after food or whatever, people would be telling people's faces and so on, and on the walls and so on. And I was really, you know, I'm a story after story, you know. So my interest in storytelling begins at my father's house with the four mothers and, you know, several siblings. Yeah. So whatever I've become, I really credit. I go back to my beginnings in this household of four mothers, and you know, and also in my mother's house as a soul. You know, especially the idea of the best was very important to me. Yeah. But storytelling was crucial. Yeah.
And your earlier writings as well, you talk a lot about Kenya's colonial past. Why is that?
You know, Kenya, was colonized by the British from about 1895. Yeah, company called British Imperial East African Company, or namely. So we are company owned. Okay, we're the property of a corporation, right? Until 1920s, when it became now colony under the direct control of the British Crown. Okay, but whatever the case, we were a colony. So our formation as Kenyans, or as Ngugi, say, is two forces are at work in my formation. One was a colonial repressive practices of the colony, okay, and the other was actually resistance to the repressive practices of the colony. So the two forces make me, and I try to recognize the two together, and they're equally important in my life. Yeah.
So fast forward to when you started writing, and you wrote your first book, which is not really quite your first book, but Weep Not My Child. But later on, you stopped writing in English and opted to write in the Gikuyu language. What informed your decision?
Yeah, you see, again, to go back, when do I begin writing? I began writing formally in 1960, when I go to Makerere University College in Uganda. That's when I think I was a first year student at Makerere at the time, when I began to write. And I wrote my first novel, The River Between, at that time, but in English. So my first few books, The River Between, Weep Not Child, 8 short stories, plays, what I wrote in my career were all in English language. And even later, up to A Grain of Wheat. Say my first 4 novels were written in English. Okay? And then something happened to me. After Makerere, I went to the University of Leeds. And then in 1966, this is very important, in 1966, I was invited to an international PEN conference. PEN is a writers' organization called PEN, held in New York at the time. It was my first visit to New York, okay? It was also the time of the Cold War, was very intense and so on. And for the first time in that conference, writers from the then Soviet Union or Eastern Europe or the communist world were allowed into America and into the conference, And I was there now as a regional guest of Africa, okay? The other writers from Latin America, it was a huge thing. And I'm here writing, I've just published my Weep Not Child, The River Between, and I was beginning to write A Grain of Wheat. And then something happened, very important. There was a panel, I remember this panel very well, called Ada Miller, who was the president of PEN. Among the panelists was Pablo Neruda from Chile, whom I met at that conference, And the other one was Ignacio Sloane, Sloane, from Italy. They were on a panel. And I remember this very well. I was sitting there, listening to them. And I think the guy who was speaking was Sloane. And then he said something like this. He was complaining about the fact that there's not much of modern Italian writing translated into English or into Western. It's not like one of these Bantu languages with 1 or 2 words in their vocabulary. And I'm the guest of Africa, regional guest from Africa. And my Africa has been attacked, right? So I couldn't wait. I stood up. I was not even meaning to speak, but I was trembling. I said, no, it's not true. I can assure you what you're calling Bantu languages or African languages have certainly more than 1 or 2 words in their vocabulary, right? Yeah, I was very upset. And then Ada Miller
Talk about that was the turning point for you.
Because when I turned, this is what happened. When I go back to Leeds to resume the novel I was writing, A Grain of Wheat, I discovered I was writing it in English. But I just come from New York defending the wealth of African languages. And I'm writing my novel, A Grain of Wheat, in English. Yeah. So when I returned to Kenya, years later, after I had finished A Grain of Wheat and Petals of Blood, I wrote, or rather, that's when I started writing Ngikuyu. Yeah.
So you champion, though, you advocate for African writers to look back at their local languages and to write in their local languages, though. In a globalized world like today where the languages are predominantly realistic?
African languages are no more local than English or Chinese, okay? There's no language in the world which is inherently global or inherently local, okay? English and French are where they are because of their globality. There's no characteristic in the language which makes them global. It's purely process of history, imperial, the colonial history and imperial history, okay? That makes it, African languages are as global as the Chinese, or as Chinese as Indian. Look at our languages as somehow local. There's not local. If African languages are local, they are local in the same way as Chinese is local to the Chinese, English is local to the English, and so on. So I like to talk about Kenyan languages, African languages, right? Yeah. And they are not inherently local or inherently global, okay? We write from the Chinese writers write from Chinese and they reach the world. English writers write from English and they reach the world. Spanish writers write and they will reach the world, right? So from Africa, we reach the world. From Africa, we reach the stars.
We'll take a short break now, but do stay tuned. We'll have more of our conversation with world-renowned author, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We'll be right back.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
So I want to get your thoughts on Kenya's political landscape, because one of your earlier protests in the late 1960s involved what you called repression, academic repression, between then the President Jomo Kenyatta and his Vice President Jaramogi Odinga. fast forward over this course, what are your thoughts on Kenya's political landscape?
Now, in Kenya, I can't talk about everything in Kenya because I have not now lived here, so I'm very careful about becoming an expert in this which are going. But I do know that many things that people now can say in newspapers, okay? For these things, many people, many patriots in Kenya were sent to prison. Some died, and I like to see Kenya really recognizing, the sacrifices that all those people made, True, I was imprisoned under Jomo Kenyatta with Moi as the vice president, but I was forced. On the other hand, when 3 years ago, when Uhuru Kenyatta received me and my family at the State House, and we talked, I liked it because we talked. He gave me 2 hours one-on-one with him, and I talked freely about my beliefs, about my, years of imprisonment and so on, I talked about the repressive practice under Jomo Kenyatta, the reign of terror under Moi, and, and all those things. I talked freely about those things, and it was important. And I appreciated that moment also, I have met with Raila Odinga, people here, and he could see me when I was in hospital, and I always appreciate, that. Just like his father, Jaramogi Odinga, came to see me once in Limuru after I came from prison. I woke up one morning and there was Jaramogi outside my house, and I really appreciated that, gesture. And for both Uhuru, President Uhuru and Raila, I give them a picture I still carry of me, Jomo Kenyatta, and Jaramogi. Okay, I'm going to interview the first president on behalf of the nation, and we took that picture. I'm going to cover an event where people from Murang'a, ordinary men and women, had brought gifts of their goats and chicken and so on to Gatodo to be sent to Nyanza, because that year there are so many floods in kind of what do you call the plains in Nyanza. And so people from Murang'a, ordinary people, chicken, whatever, they brought them to Gatondo, and Jaramogi was there to receive these gifts, so these ordinary Kenyans from Murang'a, come to identifying with the plight of ordinary people, Yeah, and that was a very important picture to me. So I gave it a copy to Raila, and I gave a copy to Uhuru, because I think how Kenya should be. Yeah.
Right, so I just want to come back to you. You've talked about having met this Kenyan leadership here. So in terms of your own personal efforts through literary writing, through your criticisms of past administrations, do you feel that your efforts for Kenya's democracy through writing, do you feel that those efforts have been recognized?
No, the very fact that we have moved, not just me, obviously. This is a struggle which has been not many ordinary Kenyans, have fought for this, and I'm very proud. But the struggle still continues, So, it's not so much recognition, me being recognized as this go here. No, but seeing the fact that it's more openness today than in my time, that's good. But I believe there's still more work to do, right? But still, where we are, its gains, and it's as a result of the thing I like to remember all the time, that what we have in Kenya is as a result of so many sacrifices by ordinary men and women of Kenya, and I'm always grateful.
Several times, but not received one as yet. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm laughing because I've been, wherever I go, I'm asked that question. I was in South Korea to receive one of the most prestigious prizes, and I was being asked about Nobel Prize. Anyway, I have no say in who is nominated and who is voted for, and I have no idea what goes on there. Okay, so that's their decision. Yeah? For me, my responsibility is to my pen. So my duty really is to continue, writing whether I get prizes or not. And I want to talk about my story. In English it's called the Upright Revolution, but Ituekare Amorogaro in Gikuyu. I wrote it in Gikuyu. I was in America for my daughter, and then some Kenyans and with the African colleagues, whom I call practical visionaries. They were producing a journal called Jalanda, and they wanted to produce a translation issue. So they asked through my son, who is also writing Africa to Africa translation. Again, the only story which I had, which was a story I had written for my daughter. Do you know that now the Upright Revolution has been translated into 78 languages in the world, most of them African, but now been translated into, in 78 languages in the world, including some American languages, from Kenya to the world. A story written in Gikuyu through translation is now in 78 languages in the world. 40, about 50 of them.
Kenya, looking at the war and the conflicts that were going on at the time during the fight for independence, it was quite a bleak time for you. So what would that young boy who started out in 1938, what would they think about your journey today and where you have reached?
I think the key thing is, I do remember those days a little bit. My older brother, one who I follow, was fighting, was part of the Kenya, Land and Freedom Army, and so we did actually go through family suffering as a result of his activities in the mountains and so on, but no more. So, quite frankly, I feel grateful that I've been able to contribute my little bit, and pay tribute to that history of resistance by Kenyan people. I'm very, very proud of it. And I like to sing about it to the whole world, right? What ordinary men and women of Kenya have been able to do in history. I take a lot of pride in that one. Yeah.
All right, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. A big thank you to Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o for his time and for sharing his insights. Remember, you can catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. We'd also love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter.